Hello there, and welcome to The Night Scientists, where we slow things down, ask big questions, and fall asleep a little smarter. Tonight, we're looking at something simple, but quietly unsettling. What if you never slept again? At first, the idea sounds useful. You'd have more time, no mornings wasted in bed, no need for alarms, just uninterrupted productivity, right? But that's not how the body works. Sleep isn't optional. It's built into the way you function, from memory to mood, from healing to survival. You don't just get tired when you skip it, you begin to break down. Let's walk through what actually happens if you stop sleeping, hour by hour. And while we do, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. I make long, slow videos like this every day to help you drift off while learning something new. Now, imagine you're lying in bed, but the night is slipping by. You glance at the clock. Maybe it's past midnight. Maybe it's closer to morning than you expected. And for whatever reason, you make a quiet decision. I'll just stay awake. Just one night, you'll be fine. You'll make up for it later. This is where it starts. Hour 0, a missed night. Most people underestimate what sleep actually does, how deeply it's tied into your health, your perception, your identity. The moment you decide not to sleep, your body begins adjusting. You may not feel it right away, but the shift starts within minutes. Two chemicals in your brain are already in motion. Melatonin, your natural night signal, is rising. It's triggered by darkness and tells your body it's time to power down. Adenosine, a byproduct of brain activity throughout the day, builds steadily the longer you stay awake. It creates sleep pressure. The more you have, the more your brain insists it's time to rest. You're not just ignoring tiredness, you're suppressing a very old biological process. Caffeine, if you use it, doesn't stop this. It just blocks adenosine's receptors temporarily. The chemical is still there, and it will hit harder once the caffeine wears off. You might feel focused, productive, even clear-headed in a way that surprises you. But underneath that, your nervous system has already noticed the breach, and your internal systems start preparing for damage control. Hour 6, the illusion of alertness. Sunlight activates your circadian rhythm. This 24-hour cycle, run by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in your brain, sends morning signals. Cortisol rises slightly, a normal, healthy spike to promote wakefulness. Body temperature begins to rise. Melatonin production is halted. It feels like a reset. Many people describe this second wind here, a renewed burst of energy that feels like they've gotten away with skipping sleep. But you haven't. This burst is temporary and deceptive. Behind the scenes, the frontal lobe, responsible for focus, decision-making, and memory, is already under stress. Your reaction time is slower. You're more likely to miss details or make errors, and your emotional regulation is slightly off. Most of this happens beneath conscious awareness. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't feel impaired, but you are. Hour 12, mental fatigue sets. In 12 hours of wakefulness without sleep starts to wear down the system. You may find yourself rereading the same text, losing your train of thought in conversation, struggling to recall names, locations, or tasks you were just working on. Your working memory, the short-term system used to hold and process thoughts, is one of the first systems affected. You might also notice shifts in mood, slight irritability, less patience, trouble with self-control. Your prefrontal cortex is tiring, and that's the part of the brain that helps you plan, regulate emotions, and respond calmly to stress. Interestingly, this is also the point where motivation may rise. Dopamine spikes are known to increase slightly during mild sleep deprivation, almost like the brain is compensating. You might feel talkative, you might even feel a little manic, but again, this is the illusion. Performance is already in decline. Hour 18, micro sleeps and mistakes. By this point, micro sleeps begin. These are brief episodes, just 1 or 2 seconds, where parts of your brain essentially shut down. They can happen while your eyes are open. You might not even realize they're occurring. One moment you're reading a sentence, the next you blink and the clock has moved forward. You lose seconds, sometimes more. If you're driving, your reaction time is already dangerously delayed. If you're cooking, working, or taking care of someone, the risks compound. The thalamus, which handles sensory information, is no longer processing input at full capacity. Motor control, attention, and judgment are weakened. Mistakes become more frequent, but worse, you might not notice your own decline. Sleep deprivation affects self-awareness, so the worse your performance becomes, the less you're able to recognize it. Hour 24. A full day without sleep, 24 hours with no rest. Your cognitive function now resembles someone with a blood alcohol content of 0.10%, legally drunk in most countries. Decision-making, logic, focus, and risk assessment are all significantly impaired. You may feel dizzy, your hands may tremble, words may come out slower, memory becomes patchy, coordination is noticeably worse. But you're not just tired, your entire brain is lagging. Emotionally, you may feel numb or overly reactive. Small frustrations trigger anger. Minor setbacks feel overwhelming. Meanwhile, your amygdala, the part of the brain that handles fear and threat detection, is becoming more active, and the prefrontal cortex that normally regulates it is going quiet. This is why people become irrational, emotional, or even paranoid after prolonged sleep loss. Hour 30, the body begins to weaken. Now the immune system starts to fail. Natural killer cells, which help protect your body from viruses and tumors, decrease by up to 70%. The body's ability to fight infection, inflammation, and cellular damage is sharply reduced. You're more likely to catch a cold. You're more likely to get sick from things that normally wouldn't affect you. In studies, even one night of sleep loss has been linked to decreased immune response to vaccines, higher markers of inflammation, reduced antioxidant activity in the blood. This isn't just about how you feel. It's about measurable biological changes. Hour 36. Hormones disrupted. Your hormonal systems begin to destabilize. Cortisol, the stress hormone, continues rising, not just in the morning, but all day. Leptin, which signals fullness, decreases. Ghrelin, which stimulates hunger, increases. This creates a perfect storm. You're stressed, tired, craving sugar and carbs, and no longer getting proper stop eating signals. Sleep-deprived individuals consistently overeat, even if they don't realize it. Testosterone drops as well. Growth hormone slows down. Wound healing is delayed. The body is in survival mode, and resources are being diverted. Hour 42, the edges of reality. Blur. Your perception begins to shift. Shadows seem to move. Sounds feel amplified or distorted. You may mishear things, or feel like you're being watched. You may see brief flashes of light or color. Hypnagogic imagery, usually reserved for the edge of sleep, now invades wakefulness. Your brain is trying to dream even while your eyes are open. This is where hallucinations often begin. They're usually mild at first, shapes, lights, distant voices, but they can progress quickly, especially in people prone to anxiety, trauma, or sensory sensitivity. You may forget what day it is, what you were just doing, what you were talking about. You may lose track of time entirely. Hour 48, 2 days without sleep. You've now gone 2 full days, 48 hours, without any sleep. At this point, your memory is unreliable. Your emotional state is fragile. You've now been awake for over 48 hours. The world feels dimmer, not darker necessarily, just a little less solid, like something's come between you and it. You can still move and speak, still go about your tasks, but everything is slower. Colors seem washed out or strangely oversaturated. Objects feel a little too far away or slightly out of proportion. Even your own voice doesn't quite sound like it belongs to you. At this stage, your brain has been in a sustained state of emergency for over 2 days. Neurons that would normally communicate smoothly are glitching. Synapses misfire. Brain waves lose their predictable rhythm. The most basic systems, like temperature regulation, appetite, and emotional control, are hanging on by threads. But what's most striking now is the mental fragmentation. Your memory is breaking down. You can't remember what you said a few minutes ago. You reread the same sentence 3 or 4 times. You try to follow a conversation, and suddenly you realize you've missed an entire part of it without noticing when or how. By day 3, most people begin to experience some level of hallucination. They're usually not dramatic. You might see shadows where none exist or think someone called your name. A quiet voice in the background, a light moving in your peripheral vision. These experiences are subtle at first, but persistent. You may blink and shake your head, trying to reset your perception, only to find it returning a few minutes later. Your visual cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing sight, begins pulling patterns where there are none, filling in gaps in ways that are creative but inaccurate. It's a protective mechanism, in a way. The brain is trying to maintain continuity, even if it has to invent it. Psychologically, your sense of self begins to drift. Something called depersonalization can take hold. You may feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, as if your actions aren't quite your own. You hear your voice, but it feels unfamiliar. You look in the mirror and don't fully recognize the expression on your face. You become detached from your thoughts, almost like your mind is running on autopilot. This isn't imagination, it's the brain separating conscious awareness from emotional processing. It happens in trauma. And sleep deprivation at this stage is trauma. You might also begin to feel like time is bending. Minutes stretch on endlessly, while hours disappear in an instant. You glance at the clock and wonder how it suddenly got dark outside. You look back 5 minutes later and somehow an hour has passed. This distortion is tied to your hippocampus, the region responsible for memory and time encoding. Without proper sleep, your hippocampus loses the ability to organize events. It's like you're watching your life on shuffle. The emotional toll deepens. By the 3rd day, the amygdala, which controls fear and emotional response, is operating without checks and balances. Normally, your prefrontal cortex keeps it in line, reminding you that a missed email isn't the end of the world, or that a mistake can be corrected. But now, that regulatory system is compromised. Stressors feel exaggerated, embarrassment feels unbearable, sadness feels bottomless, and worst of all, your mind begins looping, replaying the same regrets, the same thoughts, the same worries over and over without resolution. This phenomenon is known as ruminative thought, and sleep loss supercharges it. Physiologically, your body is trying to keep up, but it's losing ground. Your heart rate variability drops, a sign that your nervous system is stuck in a sympathetic fight-or-flight state. Blood pressure rises, inflammation spreads. Hormones that regulate hunger, reproduction, and metabolism are disrupted to the point where you may feel sick, even when you haven't eaten anything unusual. Some people describe a sensation of being poisoned or off in their stomachs, even though nothing is physically wrong. That's because the gut-brain axis, the communication line between your digestive system and your central nervous system, is highly sensitive to sleep. Without rest, the messages between them become scrambled. By the end of day 3, it's not uncommon to experience what are known as false awakenings, the sensation that you've finally fallen asleep, only to realize you were dreaming about sleeping. In reality, your brain briefly dropped into a non-REM microdream, while your body remained mostly awake. These moments can be disorienting. You feel like you've rested, you even dreamt of brushing your teeth, turning out the light, or tucking yourself in. But when you open your eyes, none of it has happened. You're still sitting where you were an hour ago. The brain is teasing you, offering a simulation of rest without the real repair. Entering day 4, deeper hallucinations often begin. These aren't just flickers of light or indistinct shadows anymore. The brain starts filling in entire people, voices, objects. You may hear someone behind you when no one's there. You may talk to someone who doesn't exist. In extreme cases, people have reported walking around their home and seeing duplicates of familiar objects, or rooms that look distorted in subtle but disturbing ways. Some describe a sensation of double vision, not of sight but of reality. It feels like two versions of the world are overlaying each other, one that makes sense and one that doesn't, and it's impossible to tell which one is real. Cognitively, even basic problem solving becomes difficult. You may forget how to use everyday tools. Simple instructions become puzzles. You forget what words mean. You can no longer picture something in your head on command. The default mode network, which normally gives your mind its internal voice and sense of continuity, starts to break down. Without it, you may feel like your thoughts are stuttering. You stop thinking in full paragraphs and begin processing in fragments. Some people describe it as thinking in pictures. Others say it's like forgetting how to think at all. By the 5th day, paranoia often sets in. It doesn't start dramatically. You might just feel like people are talking about you, that you're being watched, that something is wrong but no one's telling you what. These thoughts escalate because the parts of the brain responsible for social interpretation, like the superior temporal sulcus, are overactivated without rest. Your brain begins misreading facial expressions, tone, body language. Neutral conversations feel hostile. Friendly questions feel intrusive. You feel unsafe even in familiar places. Your speech begins to fragment. You start sentences and forget how to end them. You trail off mid-thought. You lose vocabulary. Your grammar breaks down. This isn't just tiredness. It's a symptom of disrupted Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the regions that process language. In recorded studies, participants at this stage may speak for minutes without realizing they've made no sense. And when shown the recordings later, after recovering, they have no memory of saying any of it. By day 6 or 7, motor function is heavily impaired. Tasks that require fine motor control, typing, writing, even holding a pen, become difficult. Your posture slumps, your facial expressions flatten. You may stop blinking as often, which causes eye irritation and blurred vision. Depth perception suffers. You misjudge distance and speed. You might trip, bump into things, knock over objects without realizing they were close. At this point, your brain is attempting to preserve core functions by shutting down everything non-essential, but nothing is truly safe. The scariest part is that for some individuals, the psychosis that sets in during this period can persist even after recovery. Most people bounce back after a few days of deep sleep, but in rare cases, especially when someone is already predisposed to psychiatric conditions, the hallucinations or delusions can trigger long-lasting mental health events, schizophrenia-like symptoms, panic disorders, derealization that lingers for weeks. This is part of why prolonged sleep deprivation is not just unhealthy, it's dangerous. Experiments on sleep deprivation in animals have shown fatal results. In a famous study from the 1980s, rats kept awake indefinitely developed ulcers, lost weight despite eating more, and eventually died after about 2 weeks. Their bodies literally shut down. We still don't fully understand why this happens, but we know that sleep is involved in immune repair, hormonal regulation, brain detoxification, emotional balance, and tissue recovery. And when those are gone for long enough, the body stops functioning. In humans, death by sleep deprivation is rare, but not impossible. There's a genetic condition called fatal familial insomnia, where people lose the ability to sleep entirely. It's caused by a prion mutation, and over the course of several months, the brain deteriorates. Mood swings, hallucinations, complete insomnia, dementia, and eventually death. There is no cure, no way to force sleep to return. It's proof in the most tragic way that sleep is non-negotiable, that even a perfectly functioning body cannot live without it. The truth is, by the time you reach a week without sleep, you're no longer experiencing the world as it is. You're experiencing it as your brain thinks it might be. And that distinction is everything. You are no longer making memories, only fragments. You're no longer solving problems, only reacting. Your body remains upright, your eyes remain open, but your mind is elsewhere, cycling through echoes and errors, trying to function inside a system that was never meant to operate without rest. And all of this started with a single missed night. Sleep is one of the most mysterious biological needs we have. We know what happens when we don't get it, and we've mapped its rhythms down to the waveform. But the exact why is still unfolding. That curiosity has driven some of the strangest, boldest, and in some cases most controversial experiments ever done in neuroscience. Perhaps the most famous and best documented sleep deprivation experiment happened in 1963 in California. A 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner set out to break the world record for staying awake. He wasn't part of a lab study, just a teenager with a science fair idea and 2 friends to help monitor him. What began as a dare turned into a full-scale, medically supervised test of human endurance, with sleep researcher Dr. William Dement eventually joining to make sure it didn't go too far. Gardner stayed awake for 11 straight days, or 264 hours. On the surface, he looked relatively okay. No collapse, no screaming, no medical emergency. But internally, the damage was mounting. By day 3, his mood was unstable. He became easily frustrated, withdrawn, and disoriented. By day 5, he experienced full hallucinations, including thinking he was a famous football player and that a street sign was a person. At one point, he struggled to perform simple tasks like serial subtraction or short-term memory recall. Interestingly, once he was allowed to sleep, he only slept for about 14 hours. After that, he returned to a near-normal cycle within days, but follow-up studies showed that his REM sleep spiked as his brain tried to recover the most critical phases of rest first. Some researchers believe that while he felt recovered, subtle changes in attention and memory may have persisted for weeks or even longer. Gardner's case often gets cited as proof that sleep deprivation isn't that bad, but that interpretation ignores the risks. He was young, monitored, and had no pre-existing conditions. Most people wouldn't be so lucky, and no one has attempted to break that record under observation since. In fact, the Guinness Book of World Records no longer tracks sleep deprivation feats, citing health concerns. It's not a safe game. Much of what we know today about sleep loss comes from lab-controlled studies. In these settings, researchers typically deprive subjects for 24 to 72 hours, measuring attention, hormone levels, reaction time, and brainwave activity throughout. In one such study from the University of Pennsylvania, even modest sleep restriction, just 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, produced cognitive impairment equal to 2 full nights without sleep, and the participants didn't notice how impaired they were. Subjectively, they felt a little tired. Objectively, they were mentally declining. That disconnect between how tired we feel and how tired we are shows up in almost every major experiment. It's one of the most consistent and dangerous findings in sleep research. After about 18 hours awake, your ability to self-assess begins to drop. You make more errors and worse decisions, but you don't realize it. That's why sleep deprivation is compared to alcohol intoxication. And unlike alcohol, there's no breathalyzer for fatigue. The military has long been interested in this. In high-stakes environments, combat zones, flight decks, command centers, staying alert can mean the difference between life and death. Several branches of the US military, as well as NASA, have funded studies to determine just how long soldiers or astronauts can remain functional without sleep. One such effort, known as the Air Force Fatigue Countermeasures Program, focused on developing schedules, stimulants, and behavioral strategies to extend wakefulness during missions. Pilots were tested in simulators after 24 and 36 hours awake. Even when given caffeine and allowed breaks, their performance degraded sharply after 18 to 20 hours. Micro sleeps increased, judgment faltered, and communication errors spiked. NASA, in turn, has looked at napping strategies to mitigate the effects. Their research showed that a 26-minute nap, not 25, not 30, but specifically 26 minutes, provided the best cognitive boost for pilots during long-haul flights. After that, longer naps often resulted in sleep inertia, that groggy, heavy feeling after waking, which could impair performance even more than staying awake. This precision reflects how finely tuned the body's sleep systems are. We're not designed for flexibility here, we're designed for rhythm. NASA also experimented with sleep in microgravity, where astronauts aboard the ISS face a highly unusual challenge. They orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. That means a sunrise and sunset roughly 16 times a day. This constant light exposure disrupts the body's internal clock. To manage it, astronauts wear eye masks, use light therapy, and follow tightly controlled sleep schedules. Even then, many report poor sleep, and NASA tracks the consequences closely. Cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and even immune function suffer. On long-term missions, like a future trip to Mars, managing sleep may become just as important as managing oxygen and fuel. Not all experiments are this clean. One of the most controversial studies took place in the 1980s, using lab rats in total sleep deprivation setups. In one version, a rat was placed on a small platform surrounded by water. When it entered REM sleep, the phase where muscles lose tone, it would fall into the water and wake up. Over time, rats deprived in this way developed ulcers, skin lesions, and eventually died, despite being allowed to eat, drink, and move normally. The cause of death was never fully confirmed. There was no disease, no infection, no obvious mechanical failure, just exhaustion. This study, while extreme, showed that sleep is biologically essential in ways we still don't fully understand. You can survive without food longer than you can survive without sleep. Of course, not all sleep experiments are so grim. Some explore the edges of how we schedule sleep rather than remove it. In the early 2000s, online forums and DIY science communities began experimenting with polyphasic sleep, systems where sleep is broken into multiple short segments per day. The most extreme version, known as the Uberman schedule, consisted of 6 20-minute naps spaced evenly across 24 hours, for a total of 2 hours of sleep per day. For a few weeks, many reported feeling energized and productive. They posted blogs and videos claiming they had hacked sleep, but over time, nearly all of them crashed. Focus declined, mood suffered, and motivation disappeared. The body simply wasn't adapting. The issue was REM. It's difficult, maybe impossible, for the brain to consistently enter deep or REM sleep in short bursts. Without that recovery, things begin to unravel. Most polyphasic sleepers quietly return to normal cycles after a few months, if not sooner. A less common but equally interesting field of research is lucid dreaming, the phenomenon where you're aware that you're dreaming while still inside the dream. In controlled experiments, researchers have trained lucid dreamers to move their eyes in specific patterns, like left, right, left, while inside a dream, so researchers can detect when the dream becomes lucid using REM tracking. This breakthrough allowed scientists to ask questions to dreamers in real time. Lucid dreamers were asked to do math problems, press imaginary buttons, or signal when they became aware. Their responses, measured through subtle muscle twitches or eye movements, confirmed that two-way communication during dreams is possible. These studies, while not about sleep deprivation, open the door to understanding sleep as an interactive state, not just a passive one. And then there's the Russian sleep experiment, a widely circulated story on the internet that claimed Russian researchers in the 1940s kept political prisoners awake using an experimental gas, resulting in madness, self-mutilation, and death. The tale is gruesome, cinematic, and absolutely fictional. It originated on a horror website called Creepypasta and was never based on any real study. Still, it spread rapidly, and even now, some people believe it's at least partly true. That speaks to how deeply sleep, or the loss of it, affects our imaginations. Deprivation leads to distortion, and stories, like dreams, often bend toward the unsettling. More recently, advanced brain imaging has allowed researchers to map sleep in real time. Using EEG, electroencephalography, and fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, scientists can observe which parts of the brain activate or deactivate during specific phases of sleep loss. One key finding is that the brain doesn't stay fully awake or asleep in clear segments. It flickers. Some regions begin to nap while others are still active. This is especially true in sleep-deprived individuals. You might appear awake, but parts of your brain are offline, even while your eyes are open and you're speaking. In one study, participants were kept awake for 36 hours and then asked to perform language and memory tasks inside an fMRI scanner. The scans showed that the default mode network, a system of brain regions responsible for introspection and focus, began firing randomly. It wasn't just less active, it was noisy, like a radio stuck between stations. This internal chaos was linked to slower response times, more mistakes, and emotional instability. Another study out of Harvard found that sleep-deprived brains had trouble distinguishing threatening from non-threatening stimuli. Participants were shown neutral or negative images, like a happy face or a snake, and asked to classify them quickly. Those who hadn't slept were far more likely to misidentify the images and reacted more intensely to negative cues. Their amygdala was overactive, while the medial prefrontal cortex, which normally regulates emotional response, was underperforming. This mismatch creates what we see in real life. Sleep-deprived people are more likely to lash out, shut down, or feel overwhelmed by minor stressors. One of the gentlest and most fascinating sleep studies was conducted in a cave. In the 1960s and 70s, French geologist Michel Siffre isolated himself deep underground with no natural light, clocks, or communication. He wanted to study circadian rhythms in the absence of external cues. Over the course of several weeks, he slept and woke based on his body's signals alone. What researchers found was that his internal clock shifted slightly, closer to a 25-hour day, but he still cycled through sleep and wake consistently. He didn't drift into total chaos. This suggested that while the sun helps synchronize our rhythm, the sleep-wake cycle is built in, hardwired into the human organism. Later cave experiments with multiple participants found similar results. People tended to establish their own schedules, often lengthening their days to 25 to 27 hours. They lost track of dates, but their sleep remained consistent. These experiments revealed just how powerful the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the body's internal timekeeper, really is. Even without the sun, sleep insists on returning. Taken together, these experiments show something profound. Sleep isn't just a passive state. It's not a break or a waste or an indulgence. It's an active, essential process that maintains nearly every function you depend on. Memory, attention, emotion, metabolism, immunity, and even your sense of time and identity. And while we can stretch the limits temporarily, there's always a cost. Every minute awake beyond your natural cycle adds to a debt that must eventually be paid. We've tried to cheat sleep, compress it, outsmart it, ignore it. But every serious attempt, from polyphasic schedules to stimulant regimes, ends the same way, with exhaustion, confusion, and eventual collapse. The lesson in all of these experiments is clear. You don't beat sleep, you respect it. Sleep deprivation doesn't always arrive like a storm. It doesn't always mean staying awake for days at a time, hallucinating and unraveling. In real life, it more often creeps in quietly, an hour shaved off here, a restless night there. It's chronic, not acute, and because it builds slowly, we learn to ignore it. We get used to functioning below our baseline. We forget what rested actually feels like. But the effects of chronic sleep deprivation over weeks, months, or even years are just as serious as total sleeplessness. The brain doesn't forget, the body doesn't adapt, it simply adjusts to a new, dysfunctional normal. And slowly, silently, systems begin to break down. Let's start with the brain. Sleep is essential for neural maintenance. Every day, your brain builds waste, metabolic byproducts, stress chemicals, unused neurotransmitters. During deep sleep, particularly slow-wave non-REM sleep, your brain activates the glymphatic system. This system clears out the buildup, flushing it through channels that only expand during sleep. Think of it like taking out the garbage. If you skip it for one night, nothing seems wrong. But skip it repeatedly and the waste piles up. One of the most dangerous substances that accumulates during wakefulness is beta amyloid, a protein linked to Alzheimer's disease. Studies have shown that just one night of poor sleep can increase beta amyloid levels in certain brain regions. Over time, chronic lack of deep sleep has been associated with cognitive decline, memory loss, and a higher risk of neurodegenerative conditions. It's not just correlation. There's a growing evidence that disrupted sleep may be an early cause of brain aging, not just a symptom. Memory suffers first. The hippocampus, your brain's memory gateway, becomes less efficient without rest. You can still take in new information, but it doesn't get stored properly. People who consistently sleep less than 6 hours a night show reduced activity in the hippocampus during memory tasks. In children and teens, even minor reductions in sleep, just 30 to 60 minutes less per night, have been linked to lower academic performance and attention deficits. Next comes the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. Sleep deprivation dulls its function. You become more reactive, less thoughtful. Long-term studies have linked poor sleep with increased risk-taking, poor financial choices, and difficulty with long-term planning. The part of your brain that's supposed to say, maybe don't do that, gets tired too. And when it does, the more primitive emotional systems take over. The amygdala, responsible for fear and threat detection, becomes more volatile when sleep is compromised. In well-rested brains, the prefrontal cortex keeps the amygdala in check. But with chronic sleep loss, that balance collapses. You may become more anxious, irritable, or emotionally unstable. You feel stress more intensely. Small problems seem bigger. Conflict feels personal. Emotionally, it's like walking around with raw nerves exposed. Over time, this emotional dysregulation contributes to serious mental health issues. People with chronic insomnia are significantly more likely to develop depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and bipolar symptoms. In fact, poor sleep is now considered not just a symptom of mental illness, but a predictor, a red flag that often shows up months or years before full-blown episodes. And for people already struggling with mental health, poor sleep makes treatment less effective. It becomes a feedback loop. Bad sleep worsens symptoms, and symptoms make sleep harder. But the damage isn't just in the mind. Your body pays the price as well. Chronic sleep deprivation throws off your entire endocrine system, the complex network of hormones that regulates everything from appetite to growth to sexual function. Start with metabolism. People who sleep less than 6 hours per night are at much greater risk for weight gain and insulin resistance. The reasons are clear. Sleep loss lowers leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, and increases ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates hunger, making you crave high-calorie, high-sugar foods. Combine that with reduced impulse control from the brain, and you've got a recipe for late-night snacking and poor dietary decisions. Over time, this pattern leads to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions that increases your risk of heart disease and stroke. Your cardiovascular system also suffers. Sleep is when your heart rate lowers and your blood pressure drops, a nightly reset that gives your vessels a break. Without it, your blood pressure stays elevated longer. In people with chronic insomnia or sleep apnea, the risk of hypertension, atherosclerosis, and heart attacks increases significantly. Even one bad night of sleep can raise your blood pressure the next day. Multiply that over months and the stress accumulates. Your immune system is another casualty. During deep sleep, your body produces and releases cytokines, proteins that help fight infection and inflammation. Without proper sleep, your immune response becomes sluggish. You're more likely to catch colds, take longer to recover from illness, and respond less effectively to vaccines. In fact, studies show that people who consistently sleep less than 7 hours are up to 3 times more likely to get sick after exposure to a virus compared to those who sleep 8 or more. Sleep also affects cell repair and aging. During the night, your body produces growth hormone, which helps rebuild tissues, repair muscles, and maintain healthy skin. Chronic sleep loss reduces growth hormone production, leading to slower healing and accelerated aging. Telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of your DNA, also shorten more quickly in people who are sleep deprived. Shorter telomeres are associated with increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and earlier mortality. In other words, lack of sleep doesn't just make you feel older, it actually ages you at the cellular level, and it reaches even further. In men, sleep deprivation has been shown to lower testosterone levels, reduce sperm count, and impair sexual function. In women, it disrupts menstrual cycles and reduces fertility. Both sexes experience decreased libido and increased stress-related hormone activity. Over time, these hormonal shifts can impact relationships, family planning, and quality of life. Sleep also plays a major role in pain sensitivity. Studies show that even partial sleep restriction increases the body's sensitivity to discomfort. Chronic pain sufferers often find their symptoms worsen with poor sleep. In fact, improving sleep quality is one of the most effective non-drug treatments for conditions like fibromyalgia and arthritis. Without sleep, the nervous system remains in a heightened state of alert, amplifying signals that would normally be processed more gently. And then there's microsleep, brief moments where the brain simply shuts off for a few seconds, even if your eyes are open. This is the body's emergency backup when sleep debt gets too high. In long-term deprivation, microsleeps become more frequent and harder to detect. You might be driving, cooking, or working, then blink and realize you missed a moment. These lapses can be deadly. Many major transportation disasters, including train derailments and truck crashes, have been linked to sleep-related fatigue and microsleep events. You may not even need to miss an entire night for this to happen. Studies have shown that after 2 weeks of sleeping 6 hours per night, people perform as poorly on reaction time tests as those who stayed awake for 24 straight hours. But again, the participants believed they were functioning fine. Chronic sleep loss reduces our ability to assess our own performance. We get worse at thinking and worse at realizing we're worse. One of the most difficult parts of chronic sleep deprivation is that it can feel normal. You adapt, you push through, you live in a state of semi-functional exhaustion that becomes familiar. Many people spend years in this state, brushing off brain fog, low mood, and fatigue as part of modern life. But deep down, something is being lost. Creativity, clarity, energy, emotional depth. These things fade quietly when you live in deficit. The workplace culture around sleep doesn't help. In some industries, running on 4 or 5 hours a night is worn as a badge of honor, a sign of toughness, dedication, ambition. But the science couldn't be clearer. Poor sleep makes you less productive, less accurate, and less creative. It increases errors, slows recovery, and impairs communication. Leaders and professionals who prioritize rest tend to perform better, not worse. Sleep isn't the enemy of success, it's the foundation of it. And the same goes for students, parents, and caregivers. Sleep loss in these groups is often unavoidable, but its effects are just as real. Parents of newborns often experience weeks or months of broken sleep. Students pulling all-nighters may feel sharp in the moment, but test worse than if they'd slept. Medical residents on long shifts make more mistakes, take longer to recover, and report higher burnout. Across all age groups, chronic sleep deprivation has been linked to reduced life satisfaction and increased mental health challenges. There's also a growing body of research connecting long-term sleep deprivation to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire and adapt. When you're sleep deprived, your brain is less flexible. It struggles to form new connections. It clings to old habits. Learning becomes harder. Problem solving becomes slower. Without sleep, the brain becomes a creature of repetition, not innovation. It can survive, but it cannot grow. So what's the fix? First, recognize that consistency matters more than perfection. Sleeping 8 hours once a week won't undo the damage of 6-hour nights. The body responds best to regularity, going to bed and waking up at the same time each day, even on weekends. Second, understand that quality matters as much as quantity. Interrupted, fragmented sleep doesn't give your brain the full restoration it needs. That's why minimizing light, noise, and screens before bed is so important. It's not just about getting to sleep, it's about staying there, undisturbed, through full cycles. Third, remember that recovery is possible. The brain is resilient. The body repairs itself quickly once proper sleep returns. Even after weeks of deprivation, people who return to consistent deep sleep see improvements in memory, mood, focus, and physical health. The damage slows and in many cases reverses. Sleep is not a luxury. It's not a backup plan. It's not what happens when the to-do list is done. It is the work. It's what your brain and body do every night to keep you human, present, and whole. We lose a lot when we lose sleep, but with rest, real, regular, uninterrupted rest, we gain it back. If you ask someone what sleep is for, they'll probably say rest, but that word doesn't come close. Sleep isn't a break. It's the most active time your brain and body have all day. While you lie still, your system launches a dozen parallel processes. Not just recovery, but integration. It heals tissue. It rewires memory. It regulates emotion, clears waste, balances hormones, sorts data, repairs immune response, and maintains your core identity. The body does some of this. The brain does most of it. But none of it happens properly unless you're asleep. And not just for a few hours, but through the full cycles uninterrupted. Each night, your brain follows a fixed rhythm of stages, repeated again and again, about 5 times across an 8-hour stretch. These stages aren't random. They happen in a strict pattern, and each serves a specific function. The first 3 stages, N1, N2, and N3, are part of non-REM sleep, and they take you deeper and deeper into unconsciousness. The 4th stage is REM, where brain activity spikes and dreams appear. Together, these stages form a complete cycle of physical and mental maintenance, and every time you skip or shorten sleep, you interrupt this machinery mid-operation. Sleep stages are built on changing patterns of brain waves, measured in cycles per second. When you're awake and alert, your brain is firing fast in beta waves. As you begin to wind down, alpha waves take over, slower, steadier, linked to relaxation. Then, as you drift into stage 1, those alpha waves fade into theta waves, which mark the first true shift into sleep. You might feel yourself twitch, hear sounds fade, or feel like you're falling. Those are signs you're slipping into stage 1. It's shallow, but necessary. Stage 2 brings sleep spindles and K-complexes, unique waveforms that act like gatekeepers. Spindles help protect you from waking up too easily. K-complexes help you ignore non-urgent signals. Most of the night, about 50%, is spent here, and it plays a role in stabilizing new memories and motor learning. But the real work begins in stage 3, or slow wave sleep, where delta waves dominate. This is the deepest stage. It's what leaves you feeling truly rested. Without it, your immune system weakens, your muscles don't rebuild, and your brain's waste clearance system never kicks in. During deep sleep, the glymphatic system becomes active. Brain cells shrink slightly, opening space between them so that cerebrospinal fluid can flush out metabolic waste, including harmful proteins like beta amyloid and tau, which are linked to neurodegenerative diseases. These proteins build up during the day and only get cleared at night. If slow wave sleep is cut short, this cleanup doesn't happen fully. Over time, that contributes to mental fog, memory decline, and cognitive aging. Then comes REM, rapid eye movement, the stage where things get strange. Your brainwaves begin to resemble wakefulness again, with bursts of theta and beta activity. Your breathing becomes irregular, your muscles go limp, and your mind enters a dream state. REM sleep is when memory becomes emotion. It's where you process social interactions, rehearse danger, and stabilize your sense of self. It's also where your brain cross-links information across distant networks, connecting unrelated ideas, solving problems, and generating new insights. REM is the most mentally demanding stage, and the one most likely to be lost when sleep is restricted. Most REM sleep occurs in the second half of the night. That means if you sleep only 5 or 6 hours, you may miss most of your REM entirely. You'll feel off, not just tired, but emotionally blunt or overreactive. Studies show that REM-deprived people are more sensitive to negative stimuli, less able to manage stress, and more prone to impulsive decisions. Your brain still functions, but it functions more defensively. You lose the ability to cool your reactions, to pause and reflect before acting. Memory, too, is divided by sleep stages. The hippocampus, your brain's memory inbox, temporarily holds information you learned during the day. While you sleep, that data gets handed off to the neocortex, where it's stored long term. This handoff happens primarily during slow wave sleep, and it's most effective when your sleep is uninterrupted. If you learn something and then sleep poorly, the data can degrade before it fully transfers. But even more subtle, different types of memory rely on different stages. Factual knowledge, names, dates, vocabulary, gets consolidated during deep sleep. Motor skills, like typing, playing an instrument, or throwing a ball, are refined during stage 2. Emotional learning and creative insights, that's REM's domain. Your brain doesn't treat all memories equally. During sleep, it runs a kind of priority triage, deciding what's worth keeping, what can be discarded, and what needs to be integrated with older knowledge. It doesn't just store information, it restructures it. This is why studying right before sleep often improves recall. Your brain is more likely to preserve that material when it's fresh and followed immediately by consolidation. In fact, some researchers suggest that during slow wave sleep, your brain replays the day, not consciously, but in patterns of activation across the hippocampus and cortex that mimic waking experience. It's like watching silent surveillance footage of your day, compressing it, then filing it in permanent storage. That reactivation doesn't just affect memory, it also shapes learning efficiency. People who sleep after acquiring a new skill, whether academic or physical, often perform better than those who don't. Sleep not only strengthens the new skill, but helps generalize it, extending what you'll learn to new contexts. You're not just remembering, you're building understanding. Then there's dreaming, REM's strange frontier. Dreaming is one of the most debated areas in neuroscience. Some believe dreams are just noise, random firings interpreted into story, but growing evidence suggests otherwise. Dreams may serve multiple simultaneous purposes: practicing emotional regulation, simulating threat, rehearsing social interaction, reorganizing memory, and even resolving cognitive dissonance. In one study, participants shown disturbing images had reduced emotional response to those same images the next day, but only if they had entered REM sleep. Dreaming, it seems, strips the sharp edge off memory. Even more surprising, some dreams may predict emotional recovery. After a breakup, people who dreamed about their ex tended to report faster healing weeks later. It's as if the dreaming brain is working behind the scenes to help you process, grieve, and adapt, not through logic, but through simulation, building inner models of conflict, desire, loss, and hope. And it's not just the content of dreams that matters, it's the ability to dream at all. People with certain types of brain injuries that impair REM often lose access to visual dreaming. Over time, they report reduced emotional flexibility and creativity. This supports the idea that dreaming is a form of nocturnal therapy, designed to give you emotional perspective when your waking self can't. Meanwhile, the body is still working. During deep sleep, your endocrine system resets. Growth hormone is secreted, not just in children, but in adults too, promoting tissue repair, muscle recovery, and bone strengthening. Your metabolism stabilizes. Leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that regulate hunger and satiety, are adjusted. Without sleep, ghrelin rises and leptin falls, which means you feel hungrier and less satisfied by food. This is one reason sleep deprivation contributes to weight gain, especially around the abdomen. Sleep also sharpens your immune memory. Like the brain, the immune system has to decide what to remember. During sleep, your body fine-tunes the production of cytokines and optimizes immune responses to previous exposures. Vaccines, for example, are more effective in well-rested people. The creation of antibodies is stronger, more accurate, and longer lasting. That means your body not only rests during sleep, it learns. Just as you store facts and feelings, your immune system stores patterns of past invaders, refining its future response. One of the most overlooked functions of sleep is its role in maintaining your sense of self. Over time, poor sleep erodes memory continuity, blurs emotional boundaries, and reduces the stability of your personality. People with long-term insomnia often report feeling like a different person, not because they're simply tired, but because the systems that maintain selfhood are fraying. Memory, language, mood, and self-awareness rely on regular maintenance. Sleep is what provides it. Let's zoom out. Sleep isn't just a maintenance tool, it's an evolutionary priority, something nearly all animals do, even at great risk. Birds sleep mid-flight, dolphins sleep with half their brain at a time. Insects have sleep-like states. Reptiles show primitive REM-like behaviors. That tells us something important. Whatever sleep is doing, it's worth the danger of unconsciousness. Evolution doesn't favor vulnerability unless the trade-off is survival. Among mammals, sleep needs vary widely. Elephants sleep just 2 to 3 hours a day, while bats and koalas can sleep for up to 18 hours. Predator-prey status, brain size, metabolism, and ecological niche all shape how much and how deeply an animal sleeps. But REM sleep is found across nearly all mammalian species. That suggests it's ancient, not a side effect of intelligence, but a requirement for it. In primates, including humans, REM appears to support social learning and emotional signaling. The more complex the species' social life, the more REM sleep it seems to need. Sleep also affects language, not just how we speak, but how we learn. Infants exposed to new sounds while awake retain them better if they sleep immediately afterward. Sleep strengthens phonemic maps, mental blueprints of speech sounds, which are critical for acquiring new languages. In adults, sleep improves grammar retention, vocabulary consolidation, and even accent adaptation. If you've ever dreamed in another language after studying it, that wasn't random. Your brain was practicing fluency behind the scenes. This behind the scenes rehearsal extends to emotional nuance. Sleep doesn't just stabilize mood, it refines it. It helps you detect subtle social cues, moderate emotional responses, and recover from interpersonal stress. It's part of why therapy is more effective when sleep is stable. Without sleep, people become more reactive, less empathetic, and more prone to misinterpretation. It's not just about feeling better, it's about understanding others better too. As we age, sleep changes, not just in duration, but in architecture. Deep sleep and REM both decline gradually after age 30. Older adults tend to wake more often, spend less time in slow-wave sleep, and experience more fragmented REM. This shift is natural but not harmless. It's linked to memory decline, emotional volatility, and higher risk of neurodegenerative disease. Yet the brain still tries to compensate. Even in aging brains, sleep rebounds are possible through consistent schedules, physical activity, bright morning light, and reduced evening stimulation. Sleep never stops trying to help. The body just needs support to let it. And that's the key. Sleep is not a luxury. It's not negotiable. It's a core biological function that reaches into every system we depend on. Immune, metabolic, emotional, cognitive, even moral. People who sleep well make fewer risky decisions, show more patience, and respond more ethically in complex situations. Rest shapes how you move through the world, not just whether you function, but how you behave. For decades, culture has framed sleep as something to sacrifice in pursuit of productivity. But the science is clear. The well-rested mind is more creative, and more strategic, more emotionally intelligent, and more physically resilient. Skipping sleep doesn't help you get ahead. It only delays the cost, in health, in mood, in clarity, and eventually in time itself. So, what does sleep actually do? It clears your brain, it protects your heart, it manages your hormones, organizes your thoughts, tunes your mood, builds your memories, and anchors your sense of self. It upgrades you, piece by piece, cycle by cycle, every night for free. All it asks is that you lie down and let it. If sleep is so critical, so deeply embedded in biology, then why have we spent decades trying to get rid of it? Throughout history, people have looked at sleep as an obstacle. It's inconvenient. It cuts productivity in half. You're vulnerable while doing it. And in a culture that glorifies grind, sleep has often been painted as the enemy of ambition. So it's no surprise that science and technology have asked the question, can we find a shortcut? Can we replace sleep altogether? This question has sparked some of the most fascinating and sometimes bizarre experiments in neuroscience, pharmacology, and even military research. And at first glance, the idea doesn't sound crazy. If sleep is about specific functions, restoration, memory, hormone balancing, then maybe we can do those things artificially. Maybe we can stimulate the brain in targeted ways, or take compounds that mimic the restorative effects of sleep. That's been the dream, to stay awake, stay sharp, and skip the waste of time that is unconsciousness. But the deeper science goes, the more elusive that dream becomes. Let's start with smart drugs, or nootropics, substances meant to enhance brain function, improve memory, and increase wakefulness. Some of these are basic stimulants, modafinil, armodafinil, and amphetamine salts, like those used to treat ADHD. They work. They can keep you alert, focused, even highly productive for a while. Modafinil, in particular, has been used by military pilots on long missions and by students or shift workers trying to push past natural limits. It's been called a wakefulness-promoting agent, not a stimulant in the traditional sense. And yes, modafinil can delay the need for sleep. It can suppress the sensation of fatigue and keep cognitive performance high for up to 24 hours in some cases. But it doesn't actually replace the functions of sleep. It hides the symptoms of being tired. Underneath the surface, the brain is still building up waste products, Emotional regulation is still breaking down. Memory consolidation is still stalled. After enough time, even modafinil users crash. Hard. Their bodies demand the sleep they postponed, and often they feel worse on the rebound. The military has tested these limits. In extended operations, where sleep is not an option, soldiers have been given pharmacological aids to maintain alertness. But every trial ends the same way: short-term performance gains, followed by steep drops in judgment, coordination, and emotional control. No matter how advanced the drug, no team performs better than the one that sleeps. Even elite special forces, trained to push through exhaustion, follow structured sleep cycles in real-world missions because the data is clear. Cognition collapses without it. Then came the transcranial electrical stimulation era, tech designed to nudge the brain into more efficient states. Devices like TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, or TACS, alternating current, apply gentle electrical currents to specific brain regions. The idea is to induce the kind of brainwave patterns associated with alertness, focus, or even deep sleep. Some early studies showed promise. In one, applying stimulation during sleep appeared to enhance slow-wave activity and improve memory recall the next day. Another experiment hinted that stimulating the prefrontal cortex during a nap could increase alertness, but these results haven't scaled. What works in a tiny lab study often fails in real-world conditions. Human brains are messy, variable, and sensitive. Too much stimulation causes headaches or brain fog. Too little does nothing, and even if we could safely increase certain wave patterns, we still don't know how to simulate the full choreography of natural sleep. A REM, deep sleep, hormonal cycles, immune resets, all timed perfectly in sequence. Because here's the core problem: sleep isn't a single state. It's not just about recharging like a battery. It's an orchestration, a coordinated ballet of brain regions, neurotransmitters, temperature shifts, hormonal pulses, and rhythmic wave transitions. You can't replicate that complexity with a pill or an app. You can't patch it in after skipping 4 hours. And when we try to fake it, we almost always end up chasing symptoms instead of solving root causes. Even the most advanced sleep research teams, NASA, DARPA, elite neuroscience labs, have reached similar conclusions. They've studied astronauts, soldiers, pilots, and high-performance workers under extreme sleep restrictions. They've tested micronaps, stimulants, light therapies, and even metabolic interventions. Some gains have been impressive, temporarily, but the moment the sleep debt exceeds a certain limit, performance, mood, and memory all nosedive. This is because sleep doesn't just refresh the brain, it literally reconfigures it. You can't swap that with something synthetic unless you replicate every aspect of what sleep does across multiple domains: memory, emotion, learning, immunity, hormonal balance, motor coordination, metabolic regulation, and long-term plasticity. And so far, that hasn't been achieved. Not even close. Take polyphasic sleep, for example. This is the idea that sleep can be broken into many short segments throughout the day, instead of one long stretch at night. The most extreme version is the Uberman schedule: 6 20-minute naps spaced evenly every 4 hours. Advocates claim it increases wake time, boosts clarity, and frees up dozens of hours each week. But long-term studies show that while the body can adapt to some extent, it doesn't thrive. REM and deep sleep are both sharply reduced. People become irritable, foggy, and emotionally brittle. Reaction times slow. The immune system falters. The data is clear. Short naps can support alertness, but they don't replace full cycles. The benefits are real, but they're limited and fragile. Now, consider another frontier: wearables and AI sleep optimization. These tools promise to track your stages, suggest optimal bedtimes, and even wake you during light sleep to minimize grogginess. Devices like the Oura Ring, Whoop strap, and smart watches are popular for good reason. They give people insight into their habits, and they can promote better awareness, but they also reinforce an illusion that sleep is a measurable metric you can hack. The truth is more complex. While wearables can estimate sleep stages with some accuracy, they still rely on proxies like movement and heart rate variability rather than direct brainwave measurements. And more importantly, tracking is not the same as improving. In some cases, obsessing over sleep data leads to orthosomnia, a condition where people become anxious about not sleeping correctly, which ironically makes sleep worse. The body needs rhythm and permission to rest, not constant monitoring and judgment. Still, the desire to skip sleep hasn't gone away. Silicon Valley biohackers, military strategists, and startup founders continue to look for the edge. Brain stimulation, peptides, nootropic stacks, cold plunges, neurofeedback, smart lighting, even intravenous NAD plus drips. Each one promises a piece of the puzzle: more energy, faster learning, deeper focus. And some do help, but none have replaced the system nature already built. Sleep remains the foundation. Everything else is scaffolding. There's also the fantasy of digital consciousness, the idea that one day we might upload our minds into machines and shed the need for biology altogether. In theory, a digital brain wouldn't need sleep. It could run forever, uninterrupted. But here's what that fantasy misses. Sleep isn't a flaw in the system. It's part of consciousness. It shapes how we think, remember, and feel. A mind without sleep might not be a mind at all. It would be data, but not selfhood, creativity, empathy, reflection, emotional balance. All of these emerge in part because we sleep. That brings us back to something deeper. Sleep is not wasted time. It's not a bug in the system. It's an evolved, irreplaceable, intelligent design. Every night, your brain runs thousands of invisible, background processes that keep you steady, sane, learning, and alive. So where does that leave us? In one sense, we're smarter than ever. We've built tools to measure sleep, to understand its stages, to track its quality, and to improve our routines. We've uncovered how sleep links to almost every system in the body: metabolism, memory, emotion, immunity, even morality. And we've developed ways to cope when we fall short. Naps, light therapy, strategic caffeine, cognitive techniques, and recovery protocols. But in another sense, the question that launched this entire part, can we replace sleep, has a clear answer. Not yet, not even close. You can delay it, you can cheat it for a few days, you can mask fatigue, keep your eyes open, fake alertness. But your body knows, your brain knows, it keeps score, and eventually it will collect, whether it's in mood swings, slowed reaction times, short-term memory lapses, or something deeper, like burnout, depression, or illness. Sleep debt doesn't vanish, it waits. And more importantly, even if we could replace some functions of sleep, say clean the brain artificially or stimulate memory pathways with tech, that wouldn't give us what sleep really offers, the integration of mind and self. Because sleep isn't just about recovery, it's about continuity. It's the nightly stitching together of experience and meaning. It shapes your identity, your personality, your resilience. Sleep doesn't just prepare you for the next day, it helps you remember who you are. That's why even the most hardened workaholics, soldiers, and high performers eventually circle back to protecting their sleep. It's not weakness, it's strategy. Because better sleep isn't just about avoiding mistakes or boosting performance. It's about living longer, thinking clearly, and feeling like yourself. And here's the twist. The same world that tempts us to skip sleep is now starting to rediscover its power. Leaders are rethinking 80-hour weeks. Schools are delaying start times. Athletes treat sleep as seriously as diet and training. Companies are quietly investing in employee recovery protocols. Sleep science is not fringe anymore, it's the future. In the end, we don't need to escape sleep. We need to understand it, respect it, build our lives to support it, because the payoff is massive. Clarity, creativity, emotional balance, cognitive strength, physical healing, long-term health, and none of that requires fancy tech, just time, darkness, and trust in the oldest upgrade biology ever gave us. Sleep is not a pause, it's the operating system that runs everything else. That was it for tonight. Now rest your eyes and good night.